My name is Sally Arundel and I am a principal at Mobius. I am also a leadership faculty and coach on our programs, and I lead our North American top team practice. I have the honour to introduce our first guest speaker for our NPI conference, and that is Professor Thomas Malone. Before I do, for the benefit of those that are joining us on live stream and everyone here in the room, we would like to share some context behind this very special gathering. For those of you who may be new to Mobius, we are a premier transformational leadership firm, and we have headquarters both here in Boston and in Geneva. We offer executive coaching, executive retreat services, transformational leadership programs, and top team interventions. Mobius is the home to Erica Ariel Fox's seminal work, Winning from Within, working on the inner life of the leader. And we are pioneers in the field of trauma-informed leadership development. Our annual gathering here brings together a global group of practitioners here in this very room and in our overflow room. We are coaches, mediators, facilitators, and other change practitioners. We are HR and organisational development practitioners. We are strategy and leadership advisory consultants. And we are business and non-profit executives at the forefront of change within and far beyond our organisations. We come together for a week of renewal, learning, inspiration, and practice and presence. And we are delighted that you can all be here with us today. This week-long program is sponsored by the Next Practice Institute, the professional development arm of Mobius. NPI offers transformational programs for our practitioners, partners, and our clients. NPI operates at the nexus of best practice in areas such as organisational development, culture change, and adaptive leadership, and at the nexus of next practice from across the fields of neuroscience, somatic coaching, energy work, and music and other expressive arts. Together, we are creating a global community of practice devoted to the craft of transforming people into more holistic leaders, building a more just and sustainable world, and restoring our cultural fabric. This week, we will be streaming our keynote speakers and presentations every morning and afternoon live on Facebook. On Wednesday, we will stream the Master Transformational Faculty member Thomas Hubel's mystical teachings. The QR code on the screen for those of you watching is your gateway to the quick reference links for all of this week. You can either scan the code or go to the Linktree link to find the complete agenda for this week. There is a link to our Facebook page to watch the live stream, and there's other materials such as downloading our keynote discussion guide. With all of that said, I now have the privilege of introducing our first keynote speaker for the 5th annual gathering of the Next Practice Institute. Now, in an article that he wrote in 1987, our first keynote speaker predicted many of the major changes in the internet development that came our way over the following 25 years, including that we would buy and sell a limitless amount of goods and services online. In 2004, he summarised 2 decades of his research in his critically acclaimed book, The Future of Work. He has published over 100 articles, research papers, and book chapters, and is the co-editor of 4 books. His most recent book is featured in our transformational leadership magazine, the Mobius strip, Superminds, the surprising power of people and computers thinking together. Thomas Malone is the Patrick J. McGovern Professor of Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He is also the founding director of the MIT Center for Creative Intelligence, Collective Intelligence. At MIT, he is also a professor of information technology and a professor of work and organizational studies. He's a Mobius senior expert and has been a co-founder of 4 software companies and consulted or served as a board member for many more organizations. Would you believe it? He is an inventor with 11 patents as well. What can't you do, Tom? His background includes work as a research scientist at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. He has a PhD from Stanford University and an honorary doctorate from the University of Zurich. I promise you I'm nearly done, but there's so many wonderful things to say. He also holds degrees in applied mathematics, engineering, and holds a PhD in psychology. He also teaches classes on organizational design, information technology, and leadership. When he is not doing any of that, he researches how new organizations can be designed to take advantage of the possibilities of information technology. Today, Tom is going to speak to us about how groups of people and computers working together can act more intelligently than any person, any group, or computer has ever done before. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. So what I want to do today is talk to you about my book on superminds, composed of people and computers especially, and how they can help us solve our problems. The first thing I want to do is get something out of the way. I want to say that we should be thinking much less about people or computers, and much more about people and computers. Much less about how many jobs computers are going to take away from people, and much more about what people and computers can do together that could never be done before. So that's the first message of my book. The second message of my book includes that first one, but goes much further and deeper. It, in a sense, is a new way of looking at the world that helps us see many new and interesting things, and especially helps us think about how people and computers can work together. So this second message of the book, in a certain sense, is about how to see ghosts. Now, I don't mean real ghosts, of course, but I do mean powerful entities all around us all the time that are mostly invisible unless you know how to look. These ghosts are superminds, which I define as groups of individuals acting together in ways that seem intelligent. Now, by that very broad definition, there are superminds all around us, all the time. For instance, every hierarchical company you've ever heard of is, in a sense, a supermind, a group of individuals acting together in ways that at least sometimes seem intelligent. Every democracy is a supermind as well, whether that's a democracy voting for people in a government, whether it's a club, whether it's a company, or some other group. A very important kind of supermind, though you may not think of it that way, is markets. Markets for all kinds of goods and services that are all around us all the time. And communities are also a very important kind of supermind. Whether it's a scientific community like the one shown on this slide, or a neighborhood, or some other kind of group. In fact, I suspect that the people in this room constitute a kind of community. Now, here's something that a lot of people don't realize. Almost everything we humans have ever accomplished, from inventing writing to making the turkey sandwiches I have for lunch almost every day, almost all of those things were not done by single individuals acting all alone. They were done by groups of people working together, often over time and space. Now, like individuals, these superminds are sometimes very smart. Sometimes superminds are pretty stupid. Sometimes we really like what a supermind does. Sometimes superminds can be evil. But whether we like them or not, we can't accomplish much of anything in the world without these superminds that are all around us. Now, something else we can see when we look at the world this way is that computers can help make these superminds smarter. To take just one of thousands of possible examples, I think Wikipedia is a kind of supermind. It was a supermind formed by thousands of people and computers all over the world, a new kind of supermind that created the largest encyclopedia our planet has ever known. I think that's a good example of how computers helped make a supermind that didn't even exist before, but was in many ways very smart. But it's also possible to use computers in ways that make superminds more stupid, like when fake news influences voters in a democracy. In fact, it's become fairly fashionable recently to be pessimistic and skeptical about computers and especially about AI and their effect on society. Today, I want to give you a more optimistic view. I want to give you some possibilities that I think are very positive that could happen. And I think if we use these computers wisely, we can use them to create human-computer superminds that are smarter than anything we've ever seen. One way of framing the question about how to do that, Sally actually used a little bit of it in her introduction. One way of framing the core question is this: how can people and computers be connected so that collectively they act more intelligently than any person, group, or computer has ever done before? I think that's a big, important, hard question. Now, one way people sometimes or often say we should think about this is to say, well, we need to put humans in the loop. There's nothing exactly wrong with that, but I think there's a better way of thinking about these things. And that is to start with the human groups that have accomplished almost everything we humans have ever done and add computers to those groups. Then we can use the specialized intelligence of the computers to do the things they do better than people, like arithmetic and certain kinds of pattern recognition. And then we can use the general intelligence of the people to do everything else. Now, I think even more importantly, we can also use computers and communication technology, the internet, the web, and things like that. We can use those things to create what I call hyperconnectivity, connecting people to other people, and often also to computers, at much larger scales and in rich new ways that were never possible before. Now, I think a lot of people overestimate the potential of artificial intelligence in this picture. One reason they do that, I think, is because it's so easy for us to imagine computers as smart as people. And I think one reason that's so easy for us to imagine is because our science fiction is full of that. But unfortunately, it's a lot harder to create such machines than to imagine them. On the other hand, I think we often underestimate the potential of hyperconnectivity. Perhaps because it's probably easier to create hyperconnectivity than to imagine it. In a sense, we've already created the most massively hyperconnected groups our planet has ever known, with billions of people connected to the internet. And yet it's hard for us to even understand what's happening with the hyperconnectivity we already have, much less what may be possible with the hyperconnectivity of the future. So one way of summarizing what I've just been saying is to say that I think we need to move from thinking about humans in the loop to thinking about computers in the group. So before we go any further, let's just pause for a minute and think about whether this kind of group intelligence or collective intelligence, whether that's really real. Is that really something? Is it something you could measure, for instance? Well, that's a question we've thought and worked quite a bit on in our research at MIT. In fact, to help answer that question, we used the same statistical techniques that are used in creating individual intelligence tests, like IQ tests. We used those techniques, but we applied them to groups, not to individuals. And we found that just as for individuals, there's a single statistical factor for a group that predicts how well that group can perform a very wide range of very different tasks. So we called that factor collective intelligence. We found that the collective intelligence of a group is only moderately correlated with the average intelligence of the members in the group. So just having a bunch of smart people in a group doesn't necessarily make a smart group. You all probably knew that, but here's a scientific demonstration of it. But if that's not enough to make a group smart, what is? So in our work, we found 3 other factors that were significantly correlated with the group's collective intelligence. The first is the average social perceptiveness or social intelligence of the group members. The way we measured this was by showing people pictures of other people's eyes and asking them to guess what emotion the person in the picture was feeling. It turns out that when you've got a bunch of people in a group who are good at doing that, then on average, the group's collective intelligence is higher than when you don't. The second thing we found was the degree to which people participated about equally in conversation. So if 1 or 2 people dominated the conversation, then on average the group was less collectively intelligent than when the conversation was more evenly distributed. And finally, we found that the collective intelligence of the group was significantly correlated with the proportion of women in the group. More women, more intelligent. I often get a reaction when I say that. Now, interestingly, that last factor is mostly explained statistically by the first one. In other words, it was already known before our work that women on average scored higher on that test of social perceptiveness, reading the mind in the eyes, than men. So one possible explanation of our work may be that what you need for a group to be collectively intelligent is to have enough people in the group who have this social intelligence. And if you have that, then it may not matter much whether those people are men or women. But if you don't know anything about a person besides their gender, you're more likely to get that with a woman than with a man. Now, we've done a bunch of other work along this same line using this test of collective intelligence. For instance, we've looked at groups that work together online and groups that work together face-to-face. In the online groups, the only way people could even communicate was by typing text messages to each other. But we found that in both cases, the social perceptiveness or social intelligence of the group members was equally predictive of the group's collective intelligence. Now, what I think that means is that people who are good at reading emotions in eyes have a bunch of other interpersonal skills. And they're also good at figuring out what the person meant by what they typed, or predicting how someone would react if they typed so-and-so. So what I think this gives us a hint of is that the social skills, the social intelligence that's certainly important in face-to-face organizations is likely to be at least as important in the electronically connected online organizations of the future. The social intelligence will just be manifested in different ways. We've also examined how things like diversity of cognitive style affects collective intelligence. And we found that having too little diversity isn't very good for collective intelligence, but having too much diversity of cognitive styles is also not very good for collective intelligence. What seems to be best for the collective intelligence of the group is to have a moderate level of cognitive style diversity. We found that groups that are higher in collective intelligence learn faster. And we've also tried to look at what this means in situations outside of a laboratory. One of my favorite ways we've done that is by looking at the online multiplayer role-playing game called League of Legends, one of the most popular online games, where people form teams and fight other teams using the weapons in the simulated world. So we got a bunch of teams who had played together successfully over time. In fact, they were ranked as among the best teams playing this game. We gave them our collective intelligence test, and what we found was that the teams that scored highest on the collective intelligence measure also were the ones who performed the best in the game. This is the rankings in the different categories of the game. So people who had, groups that had high collective intelligence were better at fighting other groups in this fantasy world. So I think when you put all these things together, it seems pretty clear that there is a kind of group intelligence or collective intelligence, that you can actually measure it, and that it predicts how well the group can perform many different kinds of tasks. So if that's true, then how can we increase the intelligence of a group, the collective intelligence of a group? And especially, how can we use computers to help do that? So one way that's helpful in thinking about that, I believe, is to think about the 5 cognitive processes that are necessary for any intelligent entity, whether that's a person or a computer or a group. In order to act intelligently, you need to decide what actions to take. To do that, you usually need to create some options for deciding among. You can usually do those 2 things better if you can sense the world around you and if you can remember the past. And if you're really smart, you can learn from your own experience to do all of those things better and better over time. Now, let's look at some examples of how to use computers to help groups do these things more intelligently. I want to start with the decide process. And I'm going to tell you about what I think is one of the most important things in my book, which is a categorization of 5 different types of superminds for making decisions. The first and most obvious is hierarchies, where the group decisions are made by delegating them to individuals in the group. A second is democracies, where the group decisions are made by voting. A third is markets, where the group decisions are really the combination of a whole bunch of pairwise agreements between individual buyers and sellers. And the fourth is communities, where the group decisions are made by a kind of informal consensus based on shared norms and reputations. Now, all 4 of those kinds of superminds require a certain amount of cooperation among the group members. But if you don't have any cooperation among the group members, you have what the 5th kind of supermind, which I call ecosystems. In an ecosystem, the group decisions are made by the law of the jungle. Whoever has the most power gets what they want, and the survival of the fittest. Now, let's think about some ways that computers could help make these different kinds of superminds more intelligent. Let's start with democracies. Let me start with an example of something called the Good Judgment Project, done at the University of Pennsylvania, sponsored by the US intelligence community. They were trying to predict geopolitical events, like whether Brexit would happen or who would be elected, or I made up an example, which I don't think they've actually done, but you could say, will Russia use a nuclear weapon by the end of the year? So one way of trying to predict these things would be to ask world experts on whatever the topic you're trying to predict is. What they did in this project was almost the opposite of that. They said, anyone who wants to on the internet is welcome to make these predictions. We're not going to pay you. It's not going to be your full-time job, but we'd like to see what you think. So they let people do that, and then they waited to see whether the predictions came true, or they actually used probabilities, so how close the probabilities were. And they took the people who were in the top 2% of accuracy on their previous predictions. They put these people in groups of about a dozen where they could talk to each other about the things they were predicting. They used some statistical ways of combining their answers. And they called these people super forecasters. For instance, here's one couple who were super forecasters. One of these people was an investment manager, the other a management consultant. Neither of them were world experts on any particular geopolitical issues, but they were apparently very good at finding publicly available information, mostly on the internet, analyzing it logically, and making sensible predictions based on that information. So they did a good job relative to the other super forecasters for sure. It's not clear what comparison group to compare them to know how well they did relative to other things, but we do have one tantalizing suggestion. And that's a quote in an article in the Washington Post from somebody who was part of the US intelligence community and also knew about the Super Forecasters project. He said, the super forecasters performed about 30% better than the average for intelligence community analysts who had access to all kinds of intercepts and other secret data. In other words, when you train, select, and combine good forecasters from a more or less random group of online people on the internet, you get results that are substantially better than the entire multi-billion-dollar apparatus of the US intelligence community. That seems like an interesting possibility to me. So that's one example of a kind of democracy. They're not actually voting, but they're using weighted averages of their probabilities, so I consider that a kind of democracy. Here's another example of a kind of democracy that couldn't even exist on any kind of scale without computers. It's what's called liquid democracies. Now, you all know what a direct democracy is, where everybody votes directly on every issue, like in ancient Greece. You also all know what a representative democracy is, like we have in this country and in many other countries, where you elect representatives to vote on your behalf. A liquid democracy is a very flexible combination of both of those two kinds of democracies. The way it works is you can always vote on any issue you want to, but most of us don't have the time or inclination to spend all our time trying to vote on public or other issues. So you can also delegate your voting proxy, not just to one person who's elected to represent you for years, but to anyone you want to. You can delegate your proxy to a friend, a neighbor, an expert you trust. You can give them your proxy to vote. You can do that separately for different kinds of issues. So you could give your proxy for voting on military things to one person, your proxy for voting on environmental issues to somebody else. And those people, in turn, can delegate your proxy even further if there's a particular issue that they don't know much about, but they know somebody else who does know more about that and who could also represent your interests. And if at any time you don't think the people who have your proxies are doing what you want them to do, you can always take back your proxy, vote directly yourself, or give your proxy to someone else. I think that's a pretty cool, interesting kind of idea. And it's not just a theoretical possibility. There have already been a number of political parties in countries around the world that have essentially used this by saying, if you elect a representative from our party, that representative will vote as they are told to by the registered voters who come and vote on the online platform we will create. So it's basically a way of gradually creating a liquid democracy without having to change the entire constitution. That's already happening, some in various countries. Some businesses like Google have also used this for making some low-stakes decisions. What I think is interesting about this is that it's a kind of democracy that couldn't exist without computers, but at least has the potential to represent much more directly and fully the actual interests of the people in the group that are voting. And it also has a kind of automatic way of taking advantage of more specialized information as needed for particular kinds of issues. So I think that's pretty interesting. So here's another example. This one is a market also for making predictions. So it's called prediction markets, where participants can buy and sell predictions about possible future events. For instance, if you want to try to predict your company's sales, and you think that the sales of a particular product in September will be between 1,500 and 1,600 units, you can buy shares of that prediction. And then, if it turns out you're right, you get $1 for each share you know. If it turns out you're wrong, you get nothing. So it turns out that when you do that, the price between 0 and $1 per share is effectively an estimate of the probability of that event happening, the average probability among all the people participating in the market. It also turns out that when people study this kind of prediction, they find that it usually performs at least as well and often substantially better than other prediction methods like opinion polls and focus groups and so forth, when you're predicting things like product sales or election results or other things like that. Now, if you haven't heard about this before, you might be interested to see an example of a public prediction market called PredictIt that has, among many other things, a prediction of who's going to win the next presidential election in this country. You can see it shows Ron DeSantis with 28 cents for a share, which means 28%, Trump for 26, Biden for 22. Now, does this mean that DeSantis is going to win the election because he's at the top? Absolutely not. These numbers could change many times before the election. In fact, here's a graph that shows the changes in the last month on that exact market. As you can see, if you look closely in the last week or so, DeSantis and Trump both went up a fair amount. Biden went down a fair amount. But those things may change a lot. What's interesting about this, I think, is that it is a very systematic way of getting a minute-by-minute assessment of the probability of things that based on all the information that's available at the moment. So the probabilities may well change as new information becomes available, but it's a very interesting and historically proven to be accurate method of getting those things. Now, the people or the participants in these prediction markets are almost certainly people, but an interesting question is, could you have computers participating too? A few years ago, a student and I thought that was a very interesting possibility, and we wanted to experiment with it. We wanted to try to predict things that were analogous to things like what will a competitor do in business, or what would an enemy do in wartime. But we wanted a more sanitized example for our experiments, so we decided to get people to predict what would be the next play in an American football game. Would it be a run or a pass? So we showed people videos of a football game, stopped the video just before each play began, and let people buy and sell predictions for whether the next play would be a run or a pass. We also trained some simple computer algorithms, computer agents, to make these same predictions based on a little information about the game, like what yard line the ball was on and how many yards to the next first down. The agents made those predictions and then bought and sold shares with other computer agents. And finally, most interestingly, we had some markets where both people and computers participated in the same prediction markets. So the people wouldn't know whether the most recent trade had been made by another person or by a computer. What we found was that the combination of people and computers was both more accurate and more robust to errors than either the people alone or the computers alone. So I think that shows that markets can be one interesting and useful way of combining human intelligence and computer intelligence. Okay, let's now talk about a couple of examples with communities. First, I want to talk about something called the Human Diagnosis Project. This is used in the medical field, where doctors, nurses, and other healthcare practitioners, if they have difficult cases, could enter information about the cases, like the symptoms and the lab test results, and then they could get advice from other people anywhere in the world using this system about what this diagnosis might be or what we should do about it. It turns out that, so you could imagine this being used by a doctor at MGH here in Boston, getting a second opinion from a doctor at Stanford Medical School, for instance. Or maybe, more interestingly, you could imagine it being used by a nurse in a remote African village, hundreds of miles away from the nearest doctor. In both cases, they could get best opinions in the world, potentially. It turns out that when they use this, they do have more accurate diagnoses and better clinical care. So that, I think, is a good example of the power of hyperconnectivity in making this medical community more intelligent by making it much easier for people to connect to each other in this community. It also turns out that when they do this, they accumulate a knowledge base of cases. And they've tried applying artificial intelligence, machine learning, to these cases. And what they've found is that the machine learning programs have already recognized some patterns in the cases, so that for certain common symptoms like chest pain, these programs are already almost, not quite, but almost as accurate at diagnosing as individual physicians. What I think is particularly interesting here is to imagine what will happen when systems like this have not a few thousand cases, but millions of cases. More cases than any human physician could ever see in a lifetime. I think at that point, it's very likely that these systems will become very good at diagnosing lots of diseases and probably even recognizing diseases we humans hadn't even noticed yet. So that's an example of the potential of artificial intelligence. Let me give you one more example of a community using computers. This is something called Climate Collab. This is a project we did in my center at MIT, where we wanted to crowdsource the problem of what to do about global climate change. To do that, we created an online platform called Climate Collab and an online community of over 120,000 people all over the world who were using this, participating in this community. They worked together to create and evaluate proposals for what to do about different aspects of the climate change problem. For instance, some of the proposals were about how to generate electricity with fewer emissions, or how to reduce emissions from transportation or buildings, or even how to change people's attitudes about climate change. The community, by the way, included some of the world's leading experts on climate change, but it also included business people, policymakers, students, and many other people from literally all over the world. So as you might imagine, out of this process came a number of interesting ideas. One of my favorites, I'll tell you about, was a grand prize winner one year. It was a proposal for a device called the Sun Saluter. It was a rotating solar panel that rotated during the day to follow the sun across the sky. By rotating in that way, it generated about 30% more electricity than a fixed solar panel. And the rotation was powered by dripping water and gravity. As the water dripped, it was filtered to make clean drinking water. So that same low-cost device produced both electricity and drinking water, two critical needs for millions of people all over the world. So I think that's a pretty cool idea. But what I think is even more interesting is where that idea came from. It came from the young woman pictured there named Eden Full. She had this idea when she was only 16 years old, and she later dropped out of Princeton to spend full time trying to make this idea a reality. So I think there's an interesting lesson here, which is sometimes the best solutions to difficult problems don't come from the usual suspects. They come from very surprising places. So we've seen a bunch of separate examples so far. Let's think about how you could put together these kinds of things into a larger whole. And I'd like to do that in the context of corporate strategic planning. I suspect there may be some of you in this world who've had a fair amount of experience with corporate strategic planning. As you know, it often involves, it doesn't happen all that often, like maybe once a year, maybe every quarter. It often involves the senior executives of a company, sometimes a consulting firm, and a few other people from the company, but not a whole lot of people. What I'd like us to do now is think about how we might make a corporate strategic planning process more intelligent by involving many more people than is usually done, and using computers to help analyze potentially much more data than is usually done. We could, for instance, use some kind of internal crowdsourcing, kind of like what we did in Climate CoLab, but maybe only available to people inside the company. But you could say anybody in the company can submit their ideas about things we could do in our new strategic plan. Like, here's an idea for a new product, or here's a new service, or here's a new way we could do things. Some people would submit the individual ideas. Other people could submit proposals for how to combine those ideas into coherent plans for a business unit or for the whole company. And I think it's very likely you'd get a bunch of ideas that would never have come up in a typical corporate planning process. And quite possible that some of those would be better than would otherwise have happened. In fact, you could potentially get many, many possibilities if you consider lots and lots of combinations. So one thing you would also need is a way of filtering the ideas that were suggested. One thing you could do to help that would be using prediction markets. So you could have prediction markets for things like, if we were to offer this product under certain economic conditions like recession or strong growth or whatever, what would be the likely profit we would make from that product? So you could have people inside the company and maybe outside the company participating in prediction markets to make those predictions, and you could use that to filter out the most promising proposals from the first stage. You could certainly do both of those things, the creating ideas and the filtering them out, better if you had access to a lot more data. Things like, what are customers buying now? How much are they willing to pay? Which features do they value the most? All those kinds of things that big data analytics are often very good at doing. You could also look not just at the customers, but at the suppliers and what's likely to happen with prices of the components we need in our product, et cetera. It would also be useful, perhaps, to have the computer help remember things. So you could remind people of case examples of things people tried other places and how did they work well or did they not work well. Those could give you ideas about other things you could try in your own company. You could even have suggestions about different generic strategies that they could consider. Sometimes the best strategy is to have a high quality product. Other times the best strategy is to have the lowest cost product. You could even suggest things like that by the system. And finally, you could have what I call cyber-human learning loops, where you could have humans doing certain parts of this process, like, say, evaluating elements of a strategic plan, and let the computer track the inputs that the human sees and the outputs that the human gives when doing those evaluations. And over time, you'd accumulate a database of inputs and outputs, and you could use the machine learning systems to look for patterns in that data. And if a machine learning system saw a pattern that whenever the person sees this combination of inputs, they always say X, then you could start automatically suggesting X whenever that combination of inputs comes up. And if the person accepts your suggestion enough times in a row, then you don't even need to keep asking. You could just do it automatically. So you can imagine that over time, the combination of people and computers would get smarter and smarter. So what we've just created here, or imagined here, is what you might call a cyber-human strategy machine. A system for generating potentially thousands of possible strategies, potentially very rapidly, finding the most promising ones. If something changes in the environment, you could potentially rapidly recreate a new strategy based on that new information. And it seems to me that a company that used something like this could potentially run circles around their competitors. It might be very hard to even compete with them. So it seems to me that whether this will actually happen, I don't know, but it seems like the kind of thing that somebody should be thinking very seriously about. Now, we've seen a bunch of examples so far of how to use computers to make superminds smarter. One thing you may be wondering is, well, how can we come up with ideas for things like this? Do we have to just sit and wait till inspiration strikes us? Or is there some more systematic way of coming up with innovative ideas like this? I think there definitely are systematic ways of doing that. And one thing we've spent a lot of time working on in our research center is developing what we call Supermind design. In some ways, this is like agile design or design thinking. You can use this with any of those other methodologies, but this approach focuses on something the others don't. It focuses specifically on how to come up with innovative ideas for how to design superminds, groups of people, and often computers. To do this, we use a set of moves or questions to trigger you to think about things you might not have otherwise thought of. The first of those moves the first three of them fit into a category we call basic design moves. One of them is zooming in, what are the parts or details needed to solve the problem. Another is zooming out, what's the bigger picture in which this problem arises. And a third is analogizing, what are some analogies that might give us new ideas. Now, these moves are very powerful, and they're used in lots of different creativity techniques and other design approaches. What's most novel here is what we call the Supermind design moves. The first of these is what we call groupify. So here the idea is focusing on how different kinds of groups could help solve the problem. For instance, we've just seen the 5 different types of superminds. The suggestion here is, whatever your problem is, think about how each of these different kinds of groups might be able to solve it. Most of us automatically think of hierarchies, and that's all we think of. But in many cases, there may be better ways of doing it. For instance, if you're trying to decide what health plan to have for your employees, you might have a hierarchical manager in HR make that decision. But maybe it would be better to have the HR manager identify several feasible possibilities and then let all the employees vote on which ones they would like most. Or if you're trying to decide who's going to be on different engagement teams in a consulting firm, maybe instead of having the hierarchical managers in the firm make that decision, you could have a kind of internal market where the project leaders would bid on the consultants they wanted to work with them. Maybe with real dollars, but more likely with some kind of internal currency that would then be converted into rewards in some way. So these are both trivial little examples, but the idea is that just thinking systematically about these different possibilities might well lead you to consider things you would never have thought of, and some of them might be pretty interesting ideas. So that's the groupify move. The second Supermind design move is what we call cognify, just thinking about how the different cognitive processes could be used to solve your problem. We've actually already seen an example of that a few minutes ago with the strategic planning example. And then the third move is what we call technify, thinking about how technology could help solve your problem. So one way of doing that is to just think about different kinds of technologies and think how each of them might be able to help. How could machine learning help solve our problem? How could more communication technology? How about cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin? Think about those possibilities systematically. And by the way, in all these cases, you might well realize, yeah, this doesn't really make any sense. That's not a good idea. But if you systematically consider all of them, you have a much greater chance, I think, of coming up with a good idea you would never have thought of before. So I just gave you a super fast overview of the Supermind design methodology. There's much more detail about that in a document we've written called the Supermind Design Primer. It's available online at cci.mit.edu/Supermind Design Primer with hyphens as shown there. And we'd be very happy for you to look at that and try to use that. And if you have ideas about how to improve that, we'd be very happy to hear about all those things. So please remember that website if you haven't already taken a picture of it. So before we end, I'd like to get a little bit philosophical with you. I'd like to talk about how everything I've been talking about so far, the computers, the people, how all of that is related to some of the other themes that you're also talking about this week. I said at the beginning of this talk that almost everything we humans have ever accomplished was done by groups of people, not by individuals. And I think that's more true than most people realize. I think that it's, in fact, so true that it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it, especially perhaps those of us from the more Western individualistic cultures. Many of us take for granted, I think, that the most important kind of intelligence on our planet is what's inside our individual brains. But maybe that's not the only way of looking at things, or even the best way of looking at things. Some of you, for instance, may remember Alan Watts, the scholar of Eastern philosophies, who said, "The prevalent sensation of oneself as a separate ego enclosed in a bag of skin is a hallucination, which accords neither with Western science nor with the experimental philosophy religions of the East." Now, I suspect that this may be more than just a kind of mystical mantra. I think it may be a much more accurate description of reality than we usually believe. Maybe we really are always just parts of the superminds that are all around us, and we just don't realize it. For instance, it's obvious once you think about it that the superminds we belong to have a huge influence on the languages we use and the facts we take for granted about the world around us. And maybe these superminds are much more important than we usually think in shaping almost all of our thoughts and feelings. Maybe, in fact, these superminds can have more than just intelligence. Maybe they can also have a kind of consciousness. In fact, I devote a whole chapter in my book to the question of whether superminds can be conscious. And I have an extended example of Apple Computer, the company, and whether Apple can be conscious or is conscious. I'm not going to tell you all the details of how I analyze that. I will tell you that there's a quote in the book from the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, saying, "Yes, of course, Apple is conscious." And I have a very kind of logical argument in the book that leads me also to conclude that it probably does make sense to say that Apple, and in a sense almost any company, probably does have a kind of consciousness. Now, if we follow this line of thinking even further, it suggests that as our world becomes more and more closely connected, I think it will become more and more useful to think of all of the people and computers on our planet as part of a single global supermind. Perhaps our future as a species will depend on how well we're able to use the global collective intelligence of this global supermind to make choices that are not just smart, but also wise. And if we want to go one step further, maybe we all, as individuals, have a chance to harmonize more deeply with a universal supermind that includes everything. Thank you all very much. Wow, aren't you ever going to stop clapping? Great, thank you. Eager to hear questions, thoughts, comments? Yes?
Comments about the metaverse?
The metaverse. I think, does everybody know what the metaverse is? Facebook, et cetera. It's basically creating an alternative reality, simulated reality inside computers that we all participate in, or could all participate in. I guess it's easy to be suspicious of that and think, oh no, this is some terrible techie thing where Mark Zuckerberg is trying to take over the world, and that part's probably true, by the way. I guess I'm inclined to go along with the philosopher, I think Chalmers, a philosopher who's thought a lot about consciousness, says, you know, it's not necessarily worse to have these other kinds of realities for us to interact with other humans in. I want to reserve judgment to some degree to see what happens, but it's not obvious to me that it's all bad. I think it gives new ways for people to interact with other people. Some people will probably find that a much more fulfilling place to interact than the world we have here. And maybe that's okay. Yes, Amy.
It was a very beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
I found myself wondering if social intelligence is a predictor of collective intelligence, what's a predictor of a group becoming wiser?
A very good question. The question is, if social intelligence is a predictor of group intelligence, what's a predictor of a group becoming wiser? I do talk about wisdom in my book. I guess, you know, one way of defining wisdom is to say things that is not just, you could say that intelligence is the ability to accomplish goals. And if you're intelligent, you're able to accomplish those goals more effectively. But if you're intelligent, you can accomplish many goals effectively, some of which others of us would say are bad goals. And so you could say that wisdom is not just the ability to accomplish goals, but the ability to choose and accomplish good goals. Now, that has obviously an implication that they're good and bad, and the way we would define what's good and bad is with our values. And so another way of saying wisdom is whether we have good values. I think the most useful thing I could say about that right now is consistent with what I said on my very last slide. I think that to the degree the individuals in a group are in harmony with the universe, then they as individuals are more likely to be wise and more likely to influence the groups of which they are a part to be wise. Does that make sense? Okay.
And that we are globally in more polarization. But with the polarization, now we have another element or dimension, which is AI or bots or infiltration or disruption from third parties or other governments. I mean, I think it's something many of us worry about every day. And what is your thinking, and you talked at the beginning of your talk about how you felt hopeful that the superminds or the evolution of the technology could hopefully, my hope is what I'm hearing from you, is that somehow we can develop technology to address it and disrupt it back into a way where there's more of a middle path.
Yeah, so let me use an analogy. When telephones were first installed in houses, apparently a lot of scamsters used to call people up on telephones and convince them to do all kinds of crazy things. In fact, I heard that the word phony came from that. I later heard that that was apocryphal and not true, but it's such a good story that I wanted to use it. And maybe it is true, I don't actually know for sure. But that's an example of how a new technology enabled a new kind of interaction that wasn't good. It was bad. People lost money and bad things happened. But we learned how to deal with it. In that particular case, my assumption would be that it wasn't a new technology that dealt with that. It was people learning kind of how to be suspicious of strangers who call you up on the telephone and ask for money. I think part of the solution to these things will not be new technologies, it will be cultural changes. People learn how to respond in different ways to bad things. So these fake news is hard to tell whether it's true or not, and AI makes it easy to generate fake news at much higher volume than humans could do it, and so it potentially makes the problem worse. I think in the case of fake news, we probably will need technical elements to the solution. I hope, I don't know for sure that this will happen, but I hope we will be able to develop superminds that include both people and computers. I think it's a mistake to think that this is going to be purely a technical solution. But I think it's quite possible, and I hope we will do this, to develop superminds that combine people and computers to detect suspicious things, to do certain kinds of research, and to ultimately make decisions about whether something is credible or not. Now, for that to happen, you have to have people that you trust. In fact, one thing I've come to realize more and more in recent years is that almost everything we think we know is not something we know because of our own personal experience. It's something we know because of what people we trust have said. And the same thing goes not only for facts, but for values. I think to a very much greater degree than most of us actually realize, the values we hold are not because we are kind of very upright, moral people who figured out all the right things for ourselves. The values we hold are the values that the people in our communities with our shared values have imbued in us. So to the degree that you have different communities with different value systems, that may make it very difficult to even agree on what's fake news. And by the way, I think that's one of the bad things that's happening in our country today. That the US, which used to be one community, we all watched Walter Cronkite on the 5 o'clock news, and we all believed the same facts about what was happening in the world, more or less. Today, I think perhaps just as important as social media may be Fox News, which is now a very high volume purveyor of things as facts that many people might say aren't. But that's basically now a symptom of the fact that we are increasingly having not just one national community in the United States, but at least two, where people don't even agree on the basic facts, much less the values. And that makes it very hard to even say what's fake news. What some people think is fake, other people may think is absolutely true. So you can at least, I think, have better ways of finding out what people in whatever community you identify with think is true. That doesn't necessarily solve the whole problem we're having with polarization. And I guess I have to say I'm kind of pessimistic about that. Yes?
Tom, can we ask you to take one more question?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that collective wisdom is very much linked to access to information?
That's
That collective wisdom or wisdom is very much linked to access to information, which by somehow, what you just mentioned, we are all wiser because we all have access to more information from more sources, so we can make our own decisions and not be led by just a group of people who have access to privileged information, which we don't have. So,
yeah. So maybe this is a trick question, but I would say that access to more information may make you smarter in the sense of able to respond more intelligently to accomplish your goals. I do not think that more access to most kinds of information would necessarily make you wiser. My sense of wisdom has to do with knowing what's good. It has to do with having what we would somehow collectively consider good values. And I think you can have access to all kinds of information that doesn't make your values good. If anything, perhaps having too much information makes it harder to be wise. I don't want to go on the record as saying that's necessarily true, but I certainly don't think more information guarantees more wisdom. Okay, thank you.